Gentleman from Hawaii, or Senator from Hawaii is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. After months of swearing up and down that they were focused on lowering the price of eggs, the price of groceries, the price of gas, the price of insurance. That was what the last election was about, right? It was about inflation. It was about the amount that people were paying. That's what the last election was about. Interestingly, the very first thing that Donald Trump and the Republicans have decided to do is to cut taxes for billionaire corporations. And they're going to pay for it by ripping off working Americans. Now, that might sound like a political talking point. It sounds too convenient, too absurd. How can you spend 4 years pounding on the party in power about how much people are getting hit in the pocketbook? And they were. And they were. The price of eggs, the price of utilities, the price of gasoline, still in Hawaii around $4.59 a gallon. People still paying too much. And yet the first order of business is not to do anything about that. It's not to do anything about that. It is to cut taxes for the wealthiest international corporations in human history. I'm here today with my Senate Democratic colleagues, and I want to make a sort of broader point. As Democrats struggle through, learn about, argue about what went wrong over the last 2 to 4 years politically, one of the things that we did not do well enough is stay on the same theme. This place gets crazy, and it's especially crazy with Donald Trump president, I remember. And it's distracting. And even in the best of circumstances, people fly home, and then they arrive on Monday, there's a 5:30 vote, and oftentimes the last vote is on Thursday at 1:45. And so we talk about one thing from Monday at 5:30 until Thursday at 1:45. And the thing we talk about is often whatever is on the floor or whatever is in committee. We're going to do that. We have to do that. We have to comment on what we're working on. But we're also going to talk about this rip-off tax bill, because that illustrates the difference between the parties. That is going to illustrate in 3 dimensions that all of this talk about lowering costs was a lie. I'm here with Senate Democratic colleagues, including members of the Senate Finance Committee, led by Senator Wyden on the Democratic side, who will be on the forefront of this particular fight. And we're not here because we're surprised that Republicans are going to raise and not lower costs, because we know that was the plan all along. We're not here because we're shocked that Republicans want to cut taxes for the ultra-wealthy. They do that, like clockwork, every time they win the House and the Senate and the presidency. We're here because nothing can distract us from the reality of what is about to happen. This will be a giveaway of the worst kind at a time when people can least afford it. So how do they plan to do it? And this is a little technical, so bear with me. So House Republicans are saying you've got to pay for these tax cuts, right? You reduce revenue to the government. In order to pay for it, you have to find savings. You have to either get new revenue. That's kind of off the table for Republicans. They don't like new revenue, unless it's tariffs, which Americans pay. Or you got to cut something. And so last Friday, this document was released, and I understand if you're watching this on your phone or even on C-SPAN, it's kind of small, right? I get it. But this document listed their so-called pay-fors. In other words, how are they going to pay for these massive tax cuts for the wealthiest individuals, the wealthiest privately held and publicly held corporations in human history. And here are just a couple of the things that they are using as so-called pay-fors. $700 billion in cuts, kicking millions of people off of Medicaid. $500 billion out of Medicare, reducing access to care for seniors everywhere. more than $150 billion in cuts to the Affordable Care Act subsidies. And what does that mean? If you're on ACA, if you get your health care through ACA, subsidy goes away, your monthly insurance bill is about to skyrocket. Tens of millions of Americans who pay for their health insurance through the ACA exchange and receive that subsidy are going to have to pay more. And what happens with that money? It doesn't go for roads. It doesn't go for firehouses. It doesn't go for public health. It goes to this tax cut. I am not exaggerating. This is not a rhetorical flourish. This is not a political talking point. They are literally cutting Medicare, Medicaid, possibly Social Security, the Affordable Care Act, and they're going to take all these resources, these are their pay-fors, and shovel it to people so that they can continue their private jet subsidies, pay a lower tax rate, eliminate the 15% minimum billion-dollar corporation tax. So before we passed the tax legislation when we were in charge, there were lots of the wealthiest corporations, international corporations in the history of the planet that paid zero taxes. And so what did we do? Both to generate money, but also because it's a question of basic fairness, is we established a minimum rate for these wealthy corporations. And they want to eliminate that too. Why? Because this is what they do. Because that is actually their governing philosophy. You know, they say campaign in poetry, govern in prose. That's not what's happening here. They campaigned on misleading people that their abiding concern, their main concern, was, gosh, people are paying too much for a dozen eggs. And I don't mean to diminish that. People were paying too much for a dozen eggs. But right now, inflation is 2.7%. And gas in a lot of places across the country is below $3. And so people were paying too much. And people were rightly pissed off, by the way, at Democrats too, for not recognizing how acute this problem was for a lot of American families. I get it. But I don't know anybody who thinks the solution to people paying too much out of pocket is to make them pay more out of pocket. There's not a single voter that I know, not a single voter that I know, that I've interacted with, who says, you know what? Gosh, I wish the highest corporate tax rate were just a little bit lower. Gosh, I wish the 15% minimum billion-dollar corporation tax were rescinded. Gosh, I wish people who are being subsidized so they can afford health care, I wish we would eliminate that. And gosh, I wish we would use all that money and shovel it back to the wealthiest people in the world. And so we're not going to stop talking about this. I just had 2 hearings with Sean Duffy and Marco Rubio. I know Pam Bondi was today. Lots of very exciting and interesting things are happening, and we're going to have to comment on that. We're going to have to engage in that. But every week, we're going to be talking about this ripoff. Every week, every opportunity we get, we are going to be talking about this because this is the difference between the 2 political parties. And with that, I want to yield to my very good friend who really understands tax policy and with whom I've been working on this and with whom we fought together to win the ACA fight many, many years ago, Senator Chris Murphy from Connecticut.
Thank you very much, Senator. I just can't believe we're talking about something that nobody wants, right? That's what this comes down to. The number 1 priority for Republicans is extending and likely expanding a tax cut that benefits the wealthiest 1%, 0.1% in this country at a rate that dwarfs the help for anyone else. The tax cut that we're talking about extending gives a tax cut for the top 1% of earners in this country that isn't 10 times bigger than working families at the bottom of the income scale. It's not 100 times bigger. It's not 500 times bigger. Taxpayers in the top 1% will get a tax cut 852 times larger than working families at the bottom of the income threshold. 852 times bigger. And what we have seen coming out of the pandemic is that while the broad middle of the country has been struggling, the wealthy have gotten richer and richer and richer. We have more billionaires than ever before in this country. The folks that don't rely on salaries, that can just plow their income and their earnings into the capital markets, have reaped huge, huge rewards. And so the very, very wealthy in this country right now, at this moment in time, don't need any more help. And yet, the average family that is in that top 1% bracket is going to get a tax cut on average of $70,000. Well, if you make $30,000 in this country, you're going to get about $100 back in your pocket. And of course, the theory is that if you just layer on tax cuts for corporations and for billionaires and millionaires, that money will eventually trickle down to everybody else, right? That's a lie. That's not true. That's a fraud. It's never been true. It's been perpetuated on the American public because it's a great way to rationalize giving the bulk of tax cuts to the very, very wealthy. The idea is that somehow that'll make it down to the rest of us. Go on to any main street of this country. Go into any subdivision in your state. You won't find many of your constituents who make $50,000 or $100,000 or even $200,000 that have had much of that trickle down to them. And to Senator Schatz's point, 8 years ago, when this tax cut was first put into place, it was egregious, not because of the balance only, but also because the whole thing was borrowed. All that money was just put on the American credit card, a credit card that comes due and ends up getting paid by middle-class families, one way or the other. This time around, I guess the good news is they're talking about paying for it, not borrowing to give a huge tax cut to corporations and to billionaires and millionaires. Instead, they're talking about immediately taking money out of the pockets of working families and seniors and poor people. Instead of borrowing money and have the bill come due for middle-class families later, this new tax cut for billionaires and corporations is going to be financed by an immediate cut to services and benefits to some of the most vulnerable people in this country. At the end of last year, as a means of passing the continuing resolution, there was a deal apparently cut. This is reported in the press, in which there was a promise made to finance this tax cut with $2 trillion of cuts to Medicaid and Medicare. Medicaid, poor kids, poor families, Medicare, seniors in this country. Now, $2 trillion is a hard number to get your head wrapped around. But there is no way to enact $2 trillion, a T worth of cuts in Medicare and Medicaid without hundreds of thousands of people, senior citizens and poor kids, losing access to care. You are literally, this is not hyperbole, $2 trillion worth of cuts means that nursing homes shut down. People are put out on the streets. It means that poor kids don't get access to mental health services. And so what happened 8 years ago was cruel. A tax cut put on the American public's credit card, 80% of the benefits going to the very, very richest, none of it trickling down. This version that Republicans are talking about passing in a matter of weeks is even more cruel, because it is the same balance, the benefit going to the very, very wealthy, President-elect Trump's friends who pay to get in and out of Mar-a-Lago, but financed immediately by cuts that are going to be devastating for the people in this country who get up every day relying on programs like Medicare and Medicaid. So I agree with my friend from Hawaii. We've got to be down on the floor talking about this every single day. Folks thought it was an inevitability 8 years ago when Republicans made it a priority to steal health insurance from 20 million Americans. And by the skin of our teeth, we were able to save health insurance for 20 million Americans. And maybe if we raise enough of a fuss about this massive transfer of wealth from the middle class and the poor to the very, very wealthy, we can stop this egregious policy as well. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Oregon is recognized.
Mr. President, let's talk about Trump's betrayal of middle-class America. In 2017, many of us warned that Trump's tax giveaway was a disaster for working families. It was a giveaway to billionaires. It was a giveaway to powerful corporations. It stole from America's treasury, increasing the debt of this country to gild the richest Americans. They wanted platinum treatment. They wanted more money than anybody else has ever imagined, and they got it from Trump by draining the American treasury. Well, that failed America's working families. There is nothing about giving several $100,000 to the richest Americans, that is each one of them, that helped a single working American. These policies are coming to an end in 2025. But now Trump, too, is coming along, and he says, I campaigned on working Americans, but I want to raid the programs for them and raid the Treasury to enrich them again. I didn't give them enough the first time around. The rich are not rich enough. I campaigned for working families, but I am going to betray them with tax cuts, tax giveaways, a tax rate on programs and the Treasury for the richest Americans. That is the Trump betrayal that we are facing right now. CBO says extending the Trump tax cuts would blow a $4.6 trillion hole in the federal budget over the next 10 years. And as my colleague just pointed out, Republicans are saying they might decrease the size of that hole by raiding health care for Americans. What an evil and twisted plot that is. What an assault on working families across our nation. 4.6 trillion. No, I did not say M for million or B for billion. We're talking trillion. 4.6 trillion dollars that should go to basic services for all Americans or reduce our deficit, instead going into the pockets of the very few. So who are you for? Are you for the very richest 1% and 0.1% of Americans who have so much money they don't know what to do with it? Or are you for working families? Because this Trump budget is the betrayal of working families. If you're for working families, you invest in health care, you don't raid it. You invest in housing, you don't raid housing programs. You invest in education, you don't raid education programs. Those are the foundations, those in a good paying job. Those are the four foundations for families to thrive. If you work an hourly job and make less than $34,000 a year, which is the case for 50 million American taxpayers, you'd get back $130 a year. Oh, $2.50 roughly, $2.50. All right, right now that's like less than a cup of coffee. Enjoy that every week, because that's what Trump cares about for those families who are working at the bottom of the ladder trying to move up. But instead of helping move up, he wants to take the programs away from them and give them to these folks who are going to get a $280,000 per person tax break at the very top. Look how skewed this is. Working families on the left get nothing. The richest on the right get everything. That's what we're looking at. And that little tiny $130, just a little change in the cost of drugs or your rent, Your groceries wipes that out. 2,000 times the help for the richest compared to those who are struggling. That is twisted, that is warped, that is a Trump betrayal of working families. So, let's stand for working families. Let's stand for health care and housing and education, the foundations for every family to move up the ladder. Because that's what it means to care about every American family, whether they're being the party of the elite rich, like the Trump betrayal presents. Thank you, Mr. President.
The senator from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. President, thank you. I join my colleagues on the same topic to talk about the forthcoming debate that we will have about tax policy in this chamber. Since coming to Congress, well, really before, when I was a mayor and governor, I've advocated for smart, simple, pro-growth and pro-family tax reform. Taxes should be fair, they should be consistent, they should be predictable, and they should generate the revenue that America needs to fund Social Security, Medicare, education, roads, national security, and the other critical investments that matter to our constituents. I repeat what some of my colleagues did in 2017 during the first Trump administration, after the failed effort to take health insurance away from more than 20 million people and deprive all Americans of being protected from discrimination by insurance companies if they had pre-existing conditions. And thank goodness that reconciliation effort failed when 3 Republicans joined Democrats to block that effort. The Trump administration and colleagues turned to the idea of tax reform. Now, Democrats were very willing to work on deficit-neutral, pro-growth tax reform, but instead Republicans chose, we don't want to have a committee process, we don't want to include Democrats, we want to write a bill, and we'll write a bill that will pass partisan tax cuts that will dramatically expand the deficit. At this time, and I know my colleagues remember this, economists were saying that America's corporate tax rate of 35% was high compared to global averages. And so there were some suggestions that what we should do is lower the corporate tax rate to put it more in tune with what other nations were charging. There's a little bit of an apples to oranges difficulty in doing that because other nations use a VAT tax that we don't use. But most economists said if we wanted to try to make our corporate tax rate more equivalent to other nations, we should try to lower the corporate tax rate from 35% to something like 28%. And many of my businesses in Virginia were coming to me and saying, we got to be more competitive. We got to have a corporate tax rate that matches up more with global norms. Drop the corporate tax rate to 28%. Instead, even though companies were only asking for that reduction, our Republican colleagues plummeted and slashed the corporate tax rate, not to 28%, not to 25%, but to 21%, and didn't even pay for it. Didn't even pay for it, as Senator Murphy said, just racked up higher deficits. Now, there were a few individual tax cuts in this bill. So if you look at the bill from 2017, it was mostly corporate tax cuts. There were a few in that pie chart, individual tax cuts. But they were heavily tilted towards the wealthy, as my colleagues have described. Analysis at the time showed that households in the top 1% would get an average tax cut of $60,000, while households in the bottom 60% averaged only $500 each. The bill also left out our nation's poorest children. Nearly 20 million children were left out of the full value of the child tax credit because it was not made refundable. Democrats demonstrated the American Rescue Plan that when you expand the child tax credit and allow it to be refundable, you can lead to a revolutionary drop in child poverty when it was in effect. But Republicans took a different route. And on top of these inequities, that the bill was too heavily weighted toward corporations, too light toward individuals, and with individuals too heavily weighted toward the wealthy rather than lower and middle income people, the Republican bill in 2017 did another thing that was entirely unjustified. The bill made the corporate tax cuts permanent and the individual tax cuts temporary. So big permanent corporate tax cuts, tiny temporary heavily skewed individual tax cuts. During the debate, I offered a simple amendment that virtually all my Democratic colleagues voted for. And we said, hey, look, let's go ahead and reduce the corporate tax rate. But let's not reduce it to 21%. If we reduce it to 25%, which is a big reduction, we can make these individual tax cuts for everyday people permanent, so that at least the individual tax cuts to everyday people would be permanent, like the corporate tax cuts. All of my Republican colleagues opposed it. The Senate was majority Republican, so we were stuck with a bad bill. And that brings us to today. Republicans debating how to ram another $4.6 trillion in tax cuts through the Senate. And I will remind my colleagues that when the Senate Republicans did this in 2017, they were really proud because they thought it was going to help them in the 2018 midterms. I think it was heavily driven by an electoral strategy. And what they found is, after about 90 days of talking about it, the American public was so mad that these tax cuts went to the wealthy rather than everyday people that they dropped it as a campaign issue and talked about other things and still lost badly in those midterms. The proposed extensions are going to tilt toward the wealthy, as my colleagues indicated. But get this, the deficit effects that are likely to be felt and some of these distributional effects, President Trump is proposing, why not mitigate those by jacking up tariffs? Okay, so we're going to do tax cuts that benefit the wealthy, but we're also going to do tariffs, and who will tariffs impact? President-elect Trump often says, oh, tariffs won't affect Americans, it'll hurt China and Mexico. But once the election was over, he acknowledged that he can't guarantee American families won't be affected by costs of tariffs. Well, I'm going to guarantee this. If President Trump moves forward with broad-based universal tariffs and they're not defeated in this body, American families will suffer, American families will pay the cost. We know it because we've seen it before. Study after study showed that American consumers bore the brunt of Trump's first trade war. And this time it'll be even more. Projections suggest that the tariffs will impact American families to the tune of either between $2,500 and $4,000 per American household in additional costs. $2,500 compared to this tiny little tax benefit that everyday Americans will experience. So talk about salt in a wound. We're going to do a tax bill for the wealthiest when they don't need it, not do much for everyday people who do need it, but put on the shoulders of those same people tariffs that are going to increase the cost of goods. Imagine coming out of COVID and other things and having this kind of burden put on your shoulders. There's a better path. And let me just give you an example. The Democrats are willing to work with Republicans to do tax reform that will be fair. Just last year, we saw bipartisan negotiation in the House and how that negotiation can lead to more balanced, more smart, better for the deficit, bipartisan priorities. Our colleague Senator Wyden was able to reach a deal with House Chair Jason Smith on a bipartisan tax package that would have lifted children out of poverty, the child tax credit, that would have incentivized investment into research and development, good for companies who then innovate, and that's good for jobs. And also, the third piece of this tax bill that was bipartisan would have expanded our ability to build affordable housing. And it was fully paid for. This bill got 357 votes in the House. We can't get that for a Mother's Day resolution in the House of Representatives. But then it died here in the Senate because Republicans didn't want to take the bill up because they wanted to wait to do a bill that would benefit the wealthiest. I urge my colleagues, you made a mistake before in 2017 by going down a path that busted the deficit and made the American voters really mad. Don't go down that path again. Work with us to find a tax bill that will appropriately prioritize the needs of everyday American citizens and small businesses. And with that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Senator Kaine, before you yield the floor, would you yield for a question?
I would yield for a question to my colleague from New Jersey.
I mean, that was the stunning thing about who are you for? Are you for working Americans? Are you for American families? Or are you for the wealthy of the wealthy? I watched this in a slow motion disaster for our country economically, when I was getting lobbied by corporations in the same way that you said. They were saying, we're not globally competitive, we're not globally competitive. And so everybody here, all 100 of us, want American businesses to win. So yes, I think that we should have, my opinion was, yeah, let's make our tax rate globally competitive and get rid of some of these crazy corporate tax loopholes that people use, so many companies pay zero taxes. So we could have had a bipartisan conversation that could have reflected our values, lower the overall corporate tax rate, and find a way to get rid of loopholes so corporations don't find ways to exempt themselves from taxes, where the average police officer is paying higher taxes than some of the biggest corporations. And I watched you during that time. This is 8 years ago, and you began to say, let's make sure that this tax plan benefits working Americans. Because when you invest in middle-class Americans, working-class Americans, it is a proven way to grow the economy, other than this fallacy of trickle-down. And so the stunning thing for me, and this is where I want you to, I think that was one of the most powerful points I heard, was when people were coming to me and saying 28%, 27%, 26%, the biggest corporations were saying it publicly. I was reading in the newspaper. The lowest thing I saw the corporations asking for was 25%. What were those conversations like when you were talking to our colleagues on this side? How did they end up at 21% and then not even support an amendment to bring it back up to what the corporate leaders were asking for to the benefit of working class people? How could that amendment not have passed?
The senators reminded that the questions need to be referred to the chair.
Forgive me, especially who the chair is, I'm afraid. So I direct that question to the chair, to the person here.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I'll just direct it, and my answer is going to reveal my naivete. Because my corporate sector in Virginia, and my companies are like everybody's companies, were saying, hey, drop that 35% rate to 28. I may have had one that said to 25, but they were basically saying if you do it at 28, we're going to be equivalent to other nations. When the bill was put on the table, and remember we got it with handwritten interlineations late in the evening where we didn't even have an ability to even decipher what some of the handwritten interlineations were, but we realized they had dropped it to 21%. I almost thought it was a typo. It was one of these handwritten things. I thought that was a typo because the companies were only asking for 28%. And then I looked further in this massive bill and I realized all the individual tax cuts were tiny, temporary, and expiring rather than big and permanent. And so I went to the colleagues and I said, have I got a great idea for you? You can take all these individual tax cuts if you shave off some of the ones to the most wealthy, and you can make them permanent and still do what the corporations had wanted us to do by having a corporate tax rate equivalent of other nations. I thought I was being helpful. I had a solution to a math problem that I thought they were going to like. Instead, what they said is, no, it's got to be 21%, and these individuals, they're going to be weighted to the wealthy, and they're going to be temporary.
Would the senator yield for one last question? Then I'm going to yield to Senator Lujan for his presentation.
I would be glad to yield.
Senator, I came to the floor, or to the chair, I came to the floor to listen to the good faith arguments of colleagues about the Trump tax cut. And I heard them say it would pay for themselves. This was a mantra I heard over and over again. It will pay for itself. It will pay for itself. But independent folks like the Federal Reserve Board, the Joint Committee on Taxation, found that their corporate tax cuts did not pay for themselves, but they drove our government into a multiple trillion-dollar more of a deficit, and that the benefits, this idea of trickle-down economics, the same groups I just mentioned said that 90% of workers didn't see a dime, when overwhelmingly it expanded corporate wealth and the wealth of the top 1% significantly, and didn't inure to the benefit of the postal worker, the cop, the firefighter, the plumber, the teacher. It is stunning to me that I sat here and listened to folks. But my challenge to you, because you've been sort of a pragmatic, moderate guy for a long time, and we're seeing this coming around the corner. Estimates are now that their new tax plan that they're talking about could cause a deficit to expand again by now over $4 trillion. And so you've been around here longer than I have. When we start running budget deficits that we know factually their last tax plan expanded the deficit in trillions. This one is projected, if they do it again, to the benefit of the top 1%, and again, very few of the benefits to the working Americans. What will that mean for America's fiscal stability going into 10 years from now and 15 years from now? What kind of pressures will that create? And what kind of calls do you have from Republicans about how to fix the problem that their tax plan caused?
I hope we can take this up in the Budget Committee. I have some Budget Committee colleagues who are here on the floor. Senator Whitehouse has been the lead Democrat on the Budget Committee for some time and is now at the helm of another committee. But Senator Merkley, who spoke passionately a couple minutes ago, he is now the lead Dem on the Budget Committee. We need to take up the issue of these tax cuts as proposed and explore what the long-term consequences were. The consequence will be to bust the deficit. The consequence will be to put dollars in the hands of those who don't need them and take dollars out of the hands of those who do when you combine it with the tariff effect. But the consequence will also be significant on the national debt. And as Senator Murphy said during his comments, the national debt gets financed, and it gets financed in ways that ends up coming back, and who pays for it? Everyday folks. So you'll have a compounding effect on everyday folks where they will not get tax relief. They may see their taxes increase. They'll see their prices go up with this tariff blitz, and then they'll end up being saddled with the consequences of debt. We should take the time to do this right. We should take the time to do, again, I use the example of what the Finance Committee did last year on R&D tax credit, child tax credit, and the low-income housing tax credit. Not that that bill was perfect, and not that it included everything that you might want to include, but it's an example of you don't have to jam this through with one party holding the pen and excluding the other party. You can do a tax bill that can get 357 votes in the House of Representatives on something that will be paid for, not increase the deficit, help businesses innovate, help children get a good start in life, and help people afford affordable housing. If you do it the right way, we'll come up with a good plan, and I hope that we will.
Senator, yield for one more question?
I will yield for another question.
Senator, through the chair, the senator mentioned the Budget Committee. In the hearings that we've had on the Budget Committee, in which we've discussed tax cuts and their effect on revenues and their ability to pay for themselves, how many times have our Republican colleagues been able to produce a witness who under oath would say that these tax cuts would actually pay for themselves?
Precisely zero. Even though that phrase, they will pay for themselves, they have paid for themselves, the phrase was used all the time. But no one would under oath say that that actually happened. It reminds me of a great political maxim. I think it was Eugene McCarthy, former senator, who once said, the issues candidate is the one who says the word issues the most time. Just saying these cuts will pay for themselves, that's not the same as it being true. It wasn't true in the 2017 tax cuts, and we could never find any credible witness who would come and testify to that effect. With that, I have other colleagues on the floor who are ready and raring to go, and I yield to them. Thank you.
Madam President.
A senator from New Mexico.
Thank you, Madam President. I especially want to start by giving thanks to our colleague from Hawaii for asking us to come together to have a conversation with the American people. I'm a proud senator from the state of New Mexico, from a small rural community up in the northern part of the state. And I wanted to come down to the floor to continue this conversation as we have heard from colleagues already talk about what this is and what this isn't. And it seems to me when my Republican colleagues last did this, that what I heard town hall after town hall across New Mexico is Democrats, Republicans, independents, voters, constituents, they just want to hear the truth. They want to hear what this is and what this is not. And so I'm going to start off by holding up this report that says that almost 60% of the benefit of extending the Republican tax policies will go to the top 0.1% of the wealthiest in America. 0.1% of the wealthiest in America. And I'm not talking about the other 99.9%. Now, let's define how much money people that are in the top 0.1% in America are making. They're doing very well. They're making $2.8 million per year. It's a lot of money. And they're successful. But under the guise of giving middle-class families, hardworking families all across America a tax cut where the benefit goes to the top 0.1%, if you're making $2.8 million a year, yeah, this is for you. The American people just want to hear the truth. This is not for those hardworking class families back home, my brothers and sisters, police, men and women who fight to keep us safe, EMS who respond when we need them the most, nurses, teachers, electricians, iron workers, pipe fitters. You know, all the folks across America who are doing everything they can to put some food on the table, keep a roof over their head, provide for their kids, maybe save for retirement if they have a little extra. They're playing by the rules. This golden rule promise that if you fight hard and you play by the rules, you will do better than the previous generation and you're going to help your kids and everyone that follows you. So while you are playing by the rules all across the country, and I'm talking to everyone not making $2.8 million a year, my Senate Republican colleagues are getting ready to rig the system with a tax scam that's going to give more money to the people in the top 0.1%. Remember, people making $2.8 million a year or more. Well, maybe that will let some of those folks buy another jet plane or another yacht if they're doing well. $2.8 million, a lot of money. Now, but one of the concerns across the country is, just like this happened before, my Senate Republican colleagues are going to try to do this behind closed doors, all while making false promises that this is for you, working class families all across America. But at the end of the night, all that they're going to do is stick you with the bill. Now, they're going to pay for this, as we've heard time and time again, by eliminating programs that support our veterans, programs that feed young children or babies, take care of our grandparents or elders, or giving up your child's ability to see the same doctor that they've been seeing since they were born. Now, studies show just extending this Republican tax scam would blow a $4 trillion hole. Let that sink in. Facts. Talking about the realities of what this will and will not do. Now, the incoming administration is going to try and pass this off as you heard it here, a middle-class tax cut. That's how they're going to sell this to the American people. But it's not. It's a handout to the wealthiest folks making more than $2.8 million a year. Economic analysis makes it clear that this tax scam will drive up the debt and leave working families behind. We all know the way to grow the economy is to invest in the working class, lower taxes for working families, bring industry and innovation back to our communities across the country. The success of our teachers, our nurses, our pipe fitters, our firefighters, our police officers, and everyone in between. That's the success in building up the economy across America. Now look, you've heard this from my Democratic colleagues. I and we are ready to work with my Republican colleagues to find better solutions for growing our economy and lowering taxes to prioritize them, to target the middle class, to help them. But this scam is horrible. That's why I wanted to come to the floor today to have a conversation with my colleagues, to share the facts about what's happening here with the American people, and let my colleagues know across the aisle, let's work together. Let's truly deliver on a promise to help hardworking middle-class families all across the country, including in the state of New Mexico. I want to thank you again, Senator Schatz, and I want to yield my time to my colleague from Vermont as well, who I had the honor of serving in the House and being part of this debate when this happened before. I want to thank the President. I yield back my time.
Madam President,
Senator from Vermont.
I thank my colleagues. Madam President, the situation for working families in Vermont is really, really hard. They show up in work, they get a paycheck, and at the end of the month, when they try to pay their bills, there's not enough there. The situation for families is enormously insecure when it comes to housing. We find Vermonters who are working at ski areas can't live within an hour of the ski lift that they're attending. We find that folks in factories who want to live in the community they grew up in can't afford a house. They're competing oftentimes with cash buyers, usually from out of state. And it's folks who are in the economy that have the assets and have risen the rising stock market, and good for them. But we need a tax system that is good for working families. People want to work. They want to pay their bills. And they don't want to have the constant anxiety of whether they're going to miss a mortgage payment or they're going to miss a rent payment. And to have a discussion about a tax policy that essentially funnels money to folks who have done extremely well raises a fairness question, which my colleagues have talked to, but it also raises a very practical question about how do you grow an economy? You can only grow an economy if folks who are working and committed to the communities they're in can pay their bills, can earn what they need in order to pay the grocery bill and to pay rent and health care. And that's why the starting point of tax reform should be addressing family needs that, by the way, are employer needs. The child care tax credit really worked. It meant that families were able to afford things, and we saw the results with a 50% reduction in childhood poverty. What we also see is that when we can put money into education so families can be secure about a safe place and a good place for their kids to go to school, that will work. So our starting point should be, how does this help the paycheck for the working family? And that's pretty simple. The Earned Income Tax Credit, the Child Tax Credit, low-income housing credits to build the housing that we need. That's where we have to start, funneling money to folks who are doing really well and who have a massive amount of discretionary income, and where for corporations, the capital that they need to invest is there. There is not a capital shortage. We need to focus on families, not on the well-to-do and the corporations that got a reduction in taxes that was far more than they even requested. The second point I want to make is about the process that's being used to pass the tax bill or to consider it. It's the reconciliation process. By definition, what that means is it will be a Republican-only bill. There will be no discussion among Democrats where we have some point of views that, by the way, are really beneficial to folks in my state, whether they voted for Harris or they voted for Trump. A lot of working families need that child care tax credit. The reconciliation process means that the political trade-offs have to all be in the direction of the most extreme wing of the House Republican Party. So that process is going to handcuff us right at the beginning. The third point that many of my colleagues have made is that tax cuts do not pay for themselves. You know, dream on. Folks like to say that. It's as though it's magical. They don't pay for themselves. And this tax cut will add about $4 trillion to the deficit. What's next? Then we say, hey, we've got to cut spending. What spending do we have to cut? Health care. The ACA premium support. Senator from Massachusetts, that would mean for a family in Vermont, a lot of them would pay $300, $400, $500 more each month. That's on top of the high grocery bill. So the pressure then if we have this explosion in the deficit is to cut spending, and it usually means the veterans are on the block. It means that the low-income folks are on the block. It means that health care for working families is on the block. So let's have a tax system that is fair, also promotes growth, and invest in the folks who want to work to make this economy strong, want to build strong communities, and take care of their families. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Madam President.
Senator from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, we're in a climate emergency. Over just the past few months, powerful hurricanes and severe wildfires have caused nearly $0.5 trillion in estimated damage. The Los Angeles fires are estimated to be the costliest blaze in the history of our country. Insurance is becoming unaffordable. People have lost their lives. People have lost their livelihoods. Rather than address our climate catastrophe, Republicans' highest priority is passing a new $5 trillion tax scam to subsidize the ultra-wealthy at the expense of working families. Now, Massachusetts, per capita, we're the wealthiest state in America. We're very proud of that. We believe in capitalism. But I haven't had one millionaire come up to me and say, I need a tax break, because they know they don't. And to pay for their tax scam, Republicans propose slashing Medicaid and the Affordable Care Act, ripping away food security and other supports that parents rely on to feed their children and keep a roof over their head, and ending support for clean energy, which would only add more fuel to the fires raging across our country. Los Angeles is just the most recent example. House Republicans have said they want to pay for their tax cuts for the ultra-rich with $300 billion in, quote, the Green New Deal provisions in the 2021 infrastructure bill. Well, I don't know if that means cutting programs to get lead out of our drinking water, or stopping programs to help struggling school districts buy new clean energy buses to cut costs and keep kids healthy. Maybe they have a problem with programs that let people walk and bike and live safely in communities across the country. But we're watching hundreds of billions of dollars in climate-fueled tragedy in the past few months alone. The Green New Deal is a systemic response to this crisis. I'll give you a couple of numbers. Hurricane Milton, Hurricane Helene, remember them last fall? 2 storms, 2 weeks, $300 billion worth of damage. $300 billion. They're saying, let's cut the $300 billion for clean energy programs. Oh, sure. Let's have the storms cause $600 billion worth of damage. $1 trillion worth of damage each time they come through. Sure. Why put prevention in place? Why have wind and solar ever be deployed? That's what they're coming for. It's outrageous. Donald Trump and Republicans would rather trade programs to help communities survive the climate crisis for tax cuts that help their ultra-rich donors survive tax season. And this week, in a response, I'll be introducing legislation to make polluters pay by increasing taxes on private jet fuel to $2 a gallon. You know what these billionaires for their private jets pay today? 20 cents. That's the tax on the jet fuel they put in their luxury jets to travel around America and the world. So we're just going to bump it up to $2 a gallon. And that will ultimately raise $1.8 billion. I think they can afford it, given what we're seeing happening in LA, or Florida, or North Carolina, or state after state in the last 6 months. And the tax-dodging, ultra-wealthy need to stop fanning the flames and start supporting first-class solutions. To tackle the climate crisis and to have a fair tax code, we need to ensure that those doing more than their fair share to fuel the problem are paying the bare minimum and are held accountable for contributing to the solution. So if Donald Trump and his cabinet of fat cat billionaires and the 3 richest people in the world want to fly private jets to Monday's inauguration to pay tribute to Donald Trump, the very least they can do is pay for the damage they're doing to our environment. Per passenger, private jets pollute up to 14 times more than commercial flights, and they pollute 50 times more than trains, producing as much emissions as 5 million cars every single year. You hear that? Private jets emit as much pollution as 5 million cars a year. Just a few hours of flying private offsets the benefits of an entire year of driving an electric car. And that's not fair. In just 1 year, Elon Musk's 2 private jets produce nearly 5,500 tons of carbon emissions. And that's more than 300 years' worth of emissions for the average American. Everyday Americans should not have to subsidize the lavish lifestyle of the ultra-rich. The world's wealthiest 1% burn through their entire carbon budget for the year in the first 10 days of January. 10 days. So let's not let the 1% blow a $5 trillion hole in our federal budget as well. Republicans just spent the past 2 years complaining about the Inflation Reduction Act. Yet Republicans are preparing to spend trillions on tax breaks. They want to feed billionaires greed instead of the families who will go hungry when they cut SNAP. They want to grow billionaire excess while they cut people's health care, including the 2/3 of nursing home patients and 40 million children on Medicaid, and pursue work requirements that do little. And let me just say this. Ronald Reagan, 1981, he set the playbook. Who followed it? Newt Gingrich, 1995. Who followed him? George W. Bush, 2001. Who followed him? Donald Trump, 2017. They each had the same plan. Because the Republicans have a remarkable ability to harness voluminous amounts of information to defend knowingly erroneous premises. And the central erroneous premise is that it's possible to dramatically increase defense spending, which they want to do, and which those other guys did, cut taxes for the richest people in our country, that's what all those other guys did, and then to pretend with crocodile tears that they want to balance the budget. Because all that's left are the programs for regular families, for poor families. We call it Medicaid. You want to hear another way of describing Medicaid? 2/3 of all people in nursing homes are on Medicaid. 2/3 of all people are in nursing homes being paid by Medicaid. You know what? You want to know another number about them? 50% of them have Alzheimer's. How can families keep them in a nursing home? Medicaid. You know another name we have for that? They're called Grandma and Grandpa. Grandma and Grandpa are in nursing homes with Alzheimer's because of Medicaid. They want to cut that? Good, come for it. We're ready for this discussion. The poorest children in our country, 50% of all children in our country, 50% are on SNAP, on food stamps some point in their life. That's the poorest children in our country. That's who they are. That's Medicaid. That's another way of talking about Medicaid, huh? The poorest children, the most vulnerable seniors, that's the piggy bank they're going to use for tax breaks for billionaires. And they're then going to turn and say, we're going to the Affordable Care Act. You know what another way of talking about that? That's how people get the funding for opioid treatment and for mental health treatment. That's the Affordable Care Act. That's millions of people. Yeah, just slash it, sure. Who needs to help families with mental health issues? Who needs to help families that have opioid addiction? Why do that? And then they say, we're going to go to wind and solar, and we're going to cut that too. And we're going to keep the tax breaks for the oil and gas industry. Kick them in the heart, you're going to break your toe. That's what this plan is all about. It's what the plan has always been about since 1981. So we just can't let the ultra-wealthy play while leaving hardworking Americans to pay with their health care, their financial security, and bearing the brunt of the climate atrocities. We need economic justice. We need climate justice. We need wealthy polluters to pay, especially jet-setting billionaires who are polluting right now. And we need a system that works not for the American people, not for the billionaire excess that the Republican Party is going to bring out to the Senate floor. So I thank you, Madam President, and I yield to my friend from Rhode Island, great leader, Senator Whitehouse.
I'd make the point to my friend from Massachusetts that when Democrats used reconciliation, we used the reconciliation process to do the Inflation Reduction Act and help everyone. The Inflation Reduction Act meant green jobs to red states, and it meant less pollution for everyone. The Republicans are teeing up to use reconciliation to help big CEOs, billionaires, and big corporations who are already doing amazingly well. If you feel you're being left behind by those folks, it's because you are. Look at what CEO pay has done, rocketing skyward, compared to the pay of the top 1%, other folks in the C-suite who may not be the CEO, compared to typical worker wages down here. Most Americans are right here. And most of the benefit of this tax reform will go to these folks. CEOs are taking a larger and larger share for themselves of the resources of American corporations, leaving less and less to pay their workers, and that's the difference, rocketing upward and more or less flat. And they want to make this worse through their reconciliation. If you want to add another backdrop to what's going on here, this is the share of America's revenue that's contributed by corporations. A lot of people in this body seem to want to go back to the good old days of the 1950s when, things were whatever they were then. Well, back in the 1950s, more than 30% of America's revenue came from our corporate community. Corporations were making a real and significant contribution to America's revenues and enjoying the significant growth that being an American corporation provides you. But politically, they hacked and they hacked and they hacked and they hacked away at their responsibilities, and now they're paying 6% of America's revenues. As wealthy as American corporations are, they add 6% now of America's revenues. And this, too, will be made worse by this Republican program. Half the benefits go to the top 5%. If you're over $1 million, it's a $78,000 tax cut. If you're making 50 grand, $273. Thanks a bunch. And the hit is going to come to regular Americans through Medicare, through Medicaid, and through support for their health care. They will even lower taxes for companies moving jobs and profits offshore. How about that for Make America Great Again? I tell you, when you actually take a look under the hood, what you see every time is that the benefits of these Republican tax cuts go to the biggest corporations, to the billionaires, and to corporate CEOs, and within those biggest corporations, the worst ones for moving jobs and profits offshore. It's as reliable as sunrise, and it's as wrong as it can be. I yield to my friend, Senator Rosen.
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse. Excuse me.
Senator from Nevada.
Thank you, Madam President. As it's my first time addressing you from the Senate floor since I began my second term, I'd like to start by saying how grateful I am that Nevadans have put their trust in me to serve another 6 years in the United States Senate. People in my state know that above all else, I'm a Nevadan first, before any political party or ideology. and my track record is clear. I will always support policies that work for everyone. As members of Congress, we have the opportunity to make a real and meaningful difference in people's lives. And that starts by working to make the American dream just more affordable for hardworking people. Heading into the new administration, I'm deeply concerned about President Trump's plan to cut taxes for the ultra-wealthy and billionaires on the backs of workers, senior citizens, and middle-class families. When the Trump tax cuts were first passed in 2017, they overwhelmingly benefited the wealthiest individuals and the largest corporations, while increasing our national debt and leaving the middle class and working families, well, they just left them with much less to show for it. And Senate Democrats, we will fight. We will fight to stop this from happening again. As we negotiate the upcoming comprehensive tax reform package, we must focus on making sure it provides meaningful tax relief for hardworking families, for you, for all of us. While the Trump administration and Senate Republicans look out for billionaires and corporations, Senate Democrats are working for you. For one, we should be working to restart or expand several key tax credits that help support American families, like expanding the child tax credit, which will increase the amount of hard-earned money families get to keep in their pocket. We also need to use this opportunity to address the high cost of housing, which is impacting families in Nevada and across the country. We must expand the low-income housing tax credit so that we can, well, just build more housing, increase supply, and that ultimately lowers costs for you, for everyone. As someone who grew up in a working-class family, I know what it's like to work multiple jobs and rely on tips to make ends meet. It's why we need to make sure we put money back in the pockets of hardworking Nevadans, which is why any package should include the bipartisan plan to eliminate income tax on tips for service and hospitality workers. By ending income tax on tips and adding guardrails to prevent the ultra-wealthy and CEOs from exploiting loopholes, we can make sure that Nevadans keep more of their hard-earned money. We also need to provide a broad-based tax cut for working families and the middle class, and make sure that families making less than $400,000 a year don't see a tax hike. Instead of lowering already low tax rates for corporations, we should be providing much-needed tax relief for our small businesses, like restoring research and development expensing. Our country's strength has always come from the middle class, our teachers, our first responders, our small business owners, our factory workers, families who get up every morning, every day. They send their kids off to school, and then they go out and they work hard to make our nation run. And they deserve it. They deserve the tax policies that work for them, not tax cuts that leave them behind while the wealthiest of us, the wealthiest of billionaires, the big corporations, reap the tax rewards. So let's be clear, though. If President-elect Trump and Senate Republicans don't work with Democrats, Republican tax proposals, well, they won't help you. They won't help your family. Republican tax policies are only going to help billionaires. We need to build an economy that works for everyone, for you, not just those at the top. So to all the families feeling the stress, no, you're not alone. It's time for us to put your priorities first, to lower costs, to expand opportunity. I see you, all of you, and I am ready and willing to fight for you and for all those you care about. Thank you, Madam President.
Madam President.
Senator from Nevada.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I'm joining my colleagues on the Senate floor today for the same reasons, and I so appreciate my friend and colleague from the great state of Nevada, because she is absolutely right, and my colleagues as well, drawing attention to what really is happening here in Washington that has an impact on our individuals and families back home. You know, quite often I see so many decisions being made here in this bubble in Washington without any true regard or understanding of the impact on Main Street, where we all live and we come from. And what we're talking about today is what incoming President Donald Trump had passed previously when he was president, which is this massive tax giveaway to billionaires. What the American people don't know, which we know and we're talking about, and that's why we're here, is that tax cut for billionaires is about to expire. And many of my colleagues, Republican colleagues, want to extend the entire bill at the expense of middle-class families across the country. Now, the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office says that reauthorizing the Trump tax bill as is would add $4.6 trillion to our national debt. That would raise interest rates and make it more expensive for families to buy a home, to send their kids to college, or start a business. And based on how much my colleagues across the aisle have spent the last 4 years, as I've sat in your seat, Madam President, listening to my colleagues, I've heard them say that we should be talking about the deficit and doing something about it. And I would hope that they would want to avoid adding trillions of dollars to it, regardless of who's in the White House, even now. Unfortunately, that doesn't appear to be the case. Instead, my colleagues now, my Republican colleagues, have come up with two options for selling this legislation to the American people. Again, this legislation that will mainly benefit the very wealthy in this country, the billionaires, legislation that's going to add $4 trillion to the deficit. And this is how they plan to do it. One option is Republican leadership in the Senate has suggested that because they want to extend policy that currently exists, that we should just ignore the cost of extending it. There shouldn't be a pay for, we don't have to worry about. That all of a sudden that $4 trillion increase in deficit just doesn't exist. Now, I know we all wish we could forget about the national debt sometimes, but that's not what American people sent us here to do, and that's not what American people do. I can tell you every family across this country has to live within their means and manage their budget. My family, my grandparents, my parents, everybody, every individual. So we should be working together to address this issue. The other option that I've heard from some of my colleagues across the aisle to reauthorize this Trump tax bill is they have suggested a pay-for, which is to gut Medicaid in order to pay for tax breaks, again, for the wealthiest people. I can't stress this enough. Again, tax breaks for the very, very wealthy, the top 1%, on the backs of working families, on the backs of individuals, our middle class. To me, that's just outrageous. Padding the pockets of the top 1% at the expense of hardworking families, it's unacceptable. And nobody should stand for that. And I urge my Republican colleagues and leadership in this body to work in a bipartisan manner on this and find solutions that will benefit all Americans, not just CEOs and their board members. There's a way we can come together to make sure our middle class benefits, that our companies, small businesses and companies, by the way, that are essential for that middle class and our labor force, because you need both, to work together, to benefit, and really work and identify a pay-for and how we're not going to add to the deficit. I can't stress this enough. We need to come together and build on spending reductions from the Bipartisan Fiscal Responsibility Act instead of targeting Americans' health care. And let's ensure that the wealthiest pay their fair share to protect the middle class and their children from the exorbitant trillion-dollar bill the Republicans are currently going to send to them. The two options just do not work. But there is an option that works, and I'm going to stress it one more time. We need to work together in a bipartisan way. This should not be a partisan issue. This should not be done just through reconciliation without any input from the Democrats, because at the end of the day, our families are no different. Our communities are no different. My firefighters in Nevada are no different than the firefighters in your state. My hard-working laborers in my state, whether they come from the service industry and it's somebody who is washing dishes in a restaurant in Nevada, is no different than that person washing dishes in some of my colleague states. Everybody benefits if we come together in a bipartisan way, and that's how this should work. And I am hopeful my colleagues are willing to do so. And with that, Madam President, I yield the floor.